again for more ammunition. He was wounded. He went back the third time by himself. Later they found him, and according to the citation for the Medal of Honor, he had a Japanese officer and 2 Japanese soldiers around him that he had killed. In the process, he was shot and wounded 3 times. He died later that day. The actions of Lieutenant Alexander Nininger, 57th Infantry Philippine Scouts, were the second by a U.S. Army soldier in World War II to be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, the second by a Philippine Scout. While the Philippine Scout Infantry and the American 31st Infantry Regiment counterattacked the Japanese at the east end of the Abukay Line, on January 16th, the Japanese captured the village of Morong on the west end of the Abukay Line. General Wainwright assigned the Philippine Scouts 26th Cavalry to take the village back. Lieutenant Edwin Ramsey got the call.
It happened that I led the last cavalry charge in the history of the United States Army in the Battle of Morone in Bataan. The troop commander who was taking our place was Captain John Wheeler, who had a combined troop EF, which, because half of his men and all of his American officers had been lost, I formed a line of foragers, as it's called, in the mounted cavalry, charged into the town after being fired on by the enemy, by the Japanese.
The Scout cavalrymen drew their pistols and charged into the village, firing as they went. The surprised Japanese at first fought back, but then they broke and ran.
They got no prepared positions. They're all scattered. And suddenly we came, on horseback, charging. If you're an infantryman, you know that horse coming towards you, that's a big horse. What are you going to do? You're not prepared. Run.
The cavalrymen drove off the Japanese reinforcements. They held the line. It was the last mounted cavalry charge in the history of the United States Army.
Had it not been for the courage and the training of the 26th Cavalry Philippine Scouts, I would not be alive today. I'm quite certain of that.
The U.S. Army's Philippine Scouts were the backbone of General MacArthur's forces in the Far East. They reinforced the Philippine Army's infantry divisions, counterattacked, and held the Abukay Line for 16 days, fighting off one Japanese attack after another. While the Scouts and the Philippine Army dug deeper foxholes and prepared to face another attack, the Japanese 9th Infantry Regiment climbed the steep, rocky gorges of Mount Natib in the middle of the line, carrying their artillery with them. The Japanese troops threaded their way across the mountainside and assembled behind the Abukay Line. Japanese artillery suddenly opened fire on the Abukay Line from behind. Japanese infantry units rallied to attack the line from both sides. That night, General MacArthur ordered his men to fall back once again to the Pilar Bagak line.
We were going through trails that was no trail. we made our own trail. And my horse, Mike, a very intelligent horse. Is a horse from Oklahoma, a Mustang from Oklahoma. A very well-trained horse. I love that horse. And whenever he negotiates a dangerous cliff, he look at me. He bend his neck, look at me. Yeah. Maybe he is going to warn me about impending danger. There were horses that fell down through the ravine. But my horse is very well sure-footed.
As the weary and hungry Filipino and American soldiers moved into new positions across the middle of the Bataan Peninsula, the Japanese devised a new plan. On the night of January 22, 1942, a flotilla of Japanese landing craft sailed out of Subic Bay in the dark of night. They made their way south, bringing soldiers of the Japanese 20th Infantry Regiment to the south coast of Bataan. In pitch darkness, the flotilla of Japanese boats approached. Just to their south, American PT Boat 34, commanded by Lieutenant John Bulkeley, was quietly making its way up the Bataan coast. Bulkeley heard the engines of the Japanese boats. He pushed his PT boat to full throttle and headed for the Japanese. Bulkeley circled the first landing craft and poured machine gun fire into it until it sank. He spotted a second Japanese landing craft, attacked it, boarded the boat, and sank it with machine guns and hand grenades, killing all but 2 of the crew, who he took prisoners. Bulkeley's actions broke up the Japanese flotilla, and the Japanese boatmen raced to put their soldiers ashore at 2 different locations instead of the intended landing beach. The Japanese boats landed that night at The Points on the southern tip of Bataan, a rugged area of coastline dominated by tall cliffs and guarded by inexperienced U.S. Air Corps and Navy men. The U.S. airmen and sailors fired at the Japanese landing force and tried to pin them down on the rocky shoreline. But they were no match for the Japanese commandos, who soon scaled the cliffs, drove the airmen and sailors back into the jungle, and dug in along the West Road to cut off the American supply lines. General Wainwright sent in the U.S. Army's Philippine Scouts. The scouts moved up to relieve the sailors and airmen in the dense jungle. A scout extended his hand to a sailor and whispered, "You go, Joe. I take over here." Scout companies from the 57th Infantry attacked. In a month of tough jungle fighting, the Scout infantry drove the Japanese back from the road, back to the cliffs, and pinned them down. With their backs to the sea and the Scouts pressing their attack, the Japanese fought to the death. As the Scouts drew closer, the last 150 Japanese soldiers jumped over the rocky cliffs to their deaths. The Japanese chose to die rather than surrender. By mid-February 1942, the Scouts had wiped out the entire Japanese landing force at the Points. As the fighting progressed, the Philippine Army gained combat experience and confidence, and its infantry divisions fought off heavy Japanese assaults along the Pilar Bagak front. But a gap opened up in the Philippine Army line. And during the night of January 26, 1942, 2 battalions of the Japanese 20th Infantry Regiment, more than 1,000 soldiers, infiltrated through the line into the jungle and formed 2 fortified pockets. They were heavily armed and well dug in. As the Japanese again prepared to attack the U.S. line from the rear, General MacArthur ordered the U.S. Army's Philippine Scouts to attack the Japanese. The Philippine Scouts' 45th Infantry Regiment attacked the Japanese at the Battle of the Pockets. During the fighting, an American tank got stuck in front of 2 Japanese machine guns. Lieutenant Willibald Bianchi fired his M1 rifle at the machine guns from behind the tank until he was hit twice in the left hand. He drew his pistol and continued to shoot. When he emptied the pistol, he pulled a hand grenade, threw it into the first machine gun nest, and killed the Japanese gunners. He climbed on the tank, grabbed the tank's anti-aircraft gun, and began to fire at the other machine gun. Japanese bullets hit him in the arm and chest, but Bianchi kept shooting. Suddenly, a Japanese cannon blew him off of the tank. Scout soldiers carried his battered body back to an aid station, still alive. His action was the 3rd by a U.S. Army soldier to be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor in World War II, the 3rd awarded to a Philippine Scout. Like the Battle of the Points, the Battle of the Pockets took a month. These were decisive victories. The Philippine Army troops held the front line under heavy Japanese attacks. The Philippine scouts wiped out the entire Japanese 20th Infantry Regiment, who had infiltrated behind the Filipino lines at the points and at the pockets. The Japanese commanders were beaten. They pulled their men back. They called for reinforcements.
The 50 days that General Homma had been allocated to take the Philippines had gone by, and all of the other Japanese generals were either on or ahead of their schedules. So Homma was looking pretty bad at this point. He called a meeting of his staff officers in San Fernando, just north of Bataan, and put the question to them as to what they should do about Bataan. Some of his staff officers recommended that they just wait it out. They had Bataan completely surrounded. There was no way that the Americans get any supplies in, and so there was a good chance that the American and Filipino troops there on Bataan were going to be starved out at some point in time, and why waste any more Japanese soldiers attacking this target that was going to collapse sooner or later anyway. Homma listened to these suggestions, but he was under pressure from Tokyo to go in and eliminate MacArthur's army and to conquer Bataan. So the decision was made to send for reinforcements to be brought in from Singapore and China and elsewhere. Somewhat of a loss of face for General Homma.
The scouts on Bataan fought them to a stalemate, and for a period of time, about 6 weeks, they were able to hold them off, and the Japanese had to bring troops from elsewhere after the fall of Singapore and the Dutch East Indies. But even then, in the combat that continued, the Japanese they came off about 4 Japanese killed to every 1 scout.
They lost about 7,000 Japanese soldiers. So there was a time that the front line was silent. So we were wondering what happened, and they were waiting reinforcement from Singapore.
They fought the Japanese to a standstill, but unfortunately we did not have enough scouts, we did not have enough ammunition, food, and medicine.
The Battle of Bataan lapsed into a period of quiet. Thousands of men had been lost on both sides. The Japanese withdrew to the north end of the peninsula and left the Filipino and American troops to regroup and take stock of their supplies. The big problem was lack of food. Headquarters told the men that a U.S. Navy convoy was on the way from the States, bringing American reinforcements, food, ammunition, and medicine. The men had been on half rations since the 1st of January, and by the 1st of March, they were growing weak. Almost everyone had lost about 25% of their normal body weight. Diseases like malaria, dysentery, and beriberi took a serious toll. From radio broadcasts, the men learned how badly Pearl Harbor had been damaged in the Japanese attack. They learned about the fall of Singapore and Japanese attacks on Australia. They wondered, how could the reinforcement convoy possibly get through with the whole Pacific Ocean in Japanese hands? In March, the quartermaster rounded up all of the 26th Cavalry's horses and took them to the Bataan slaughterhouse to provide meat for the troops.
When they were going to lead the horse away from me after the mounted charge, when they were going to lead the horse and do his final duty, you know, he followed the guy who was leading him with his tie rope, and then a few distance away, he looked back at me. That hurt me so much. Until now, if I think about that thing, it hurt me so much.
The kitchens ran out of flour and rice ran low. Officers encouraged their men to take advantage of the lull in the fighting and scrounge the fields for vegetables and small animals to eat. Hunger and disease, and rumors that fresh Japanese troops were arriving, undermined morale. Japanese ships sailed into Subic Bay, filled with supplies and reinforcements.
But then you could see all the ship going in. We didn't know that it's coming from the Far East. Then we find out that the reinforcement. How could we get ready? We running out of ammo. No plane, nothing.
The American and Filipino soldiers were short on food. The field hospital on Bataan was seeing as many as 500 new cases of malaria each day, but there was not enough medicine to go around. Men climbed tall trees along the coast to look out to sea for the American reinforcement convoy. But there was no convoy. No reinforcements.
No mama. No papa. No Uncle Sam. No aunts. No uncles. No cousins. No nieces. No pills, no planes, no artillery pieces, and nobody gives a damn. We're the battling bastards of Bataan. American correspondent Frank Hewlett.
To U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the situation on Bataan looked hopeless. The last thing the president wanted to see was a photo of General Douglas MacArthur, America's most popular general, on the front page of a Japanese newspaper, in chains. Roosevelt ordered MacArthur out of the Philippines. On March 11, 1942, General Douglas MacArthur and his senior staff officers boarded two of Lieutenant John Bulkeley's PT boats and sped away across 600 miles of open ocean to Mindanao in the Southern Islands. There, a B-17 bomber picked them up and flew them to Australia. MacArthur was gone, but the Philippine scouts maintained faith in their leader. Surely, General MacArthur would be back soon, leading the reinforcement convoy. With MacArthur in Australia, Major General Jonathan Wainwright took command of the Allied headquarters on Corregidor. He appointed Major General Edward P. King commander of Bataan forces.
General Wainwright was an old cavalryman, and he was known to enjoy a cold beer at the end of the day after riding around in saddle all afternoon. And he would go to the officers' club and have a cold one. And Homa knew this. Homa knew a lot about the American generals. So he devised a request to General Wainwright suggesting that he surrender before any more of the Filipino and American soldiers were killed. If Wainwright refused the request, then Homa said that he would feel free to take whatever action he deemed necessary. To deliver the message, he had a bomber fly over Bataan and Corregidor, and they dropped hundreds of beer cans out of the bomber, each one with a copy of the message inside, under Homa's assumption that one of the soldiers would pick it up and take it to Wainwright, which in fact is what happened. Wainwright read the message, decided that he wasn't going to surrender. Not only that, he wasn't even going to bother to respond to the message. His one comment on it was, well, the bastard could at least have dropped a few full cans of beer.
For 4 months, the Philippine Scouts and Philippine Army held out with little food, dwindling ammunition, and almost no medicine. They tied the Japanese army down in the Philippines, delayed the Japanese march across the Pacific, and bought the United States valuable time to rebuild America's Pacific Fleet. On Bataan, food rations were cut again, and General King watched as his men grew steadily weaker. On Good Friday, April 3, 1942, General Homa took action. He launched a deadly attack on the defenders of Bataan.
They told us, here comes the final blow. What kind of blow is it? The Japanese reinforcement, crack troops, you know. They were Japanese and Koreans.
General Homa brought 60 heavy bombers from Malaya to soften up the Filipino-American lines. Fresh Japanese infantry and artillerymen moved into position behind the hills north of the Pilar Bagak line. They received their final instructions. 150 Japanese artillery pieces pounded the Filipino-American lines, while heavy bombers dropped tons of bombs on General King's troops. The intense barrage continued for 5 hours with devastating results. The bombing knocked out the Americans' and Filipinos' communication lines. It destroyed their defense positions, and Japanese incendiary bombs set the jungle on fire around them. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Japanese tanks and infantry attacked. The weakened Filipino and American soldiers fought back, but one by one, their defenses crumbled. On Monday, April 6, General King ordered his men to counterattack. But the Japanese were too strong, and the counterattack failed. As the Japanese troops advanced, General Wainwright ordered another counterattack. But General King's commanders reported that their men were too weak to rise out of their foxholes and attack the enemy.
So we fought until this, the night of April 8th. We heard that they were bursting all the ammunition the night of April 8th. And we found out that it was surrendered the following day. I saw to my side Colonel Pierce, who became a general, so we call him General Pierce, another general, Colonel Vance, General Parker. I saw them captured by the Japanese.
Despite orders to counterattack, to fight on, to fight to the death if necessary, General Edward King decided that it was pointless to see any more of his men slaughtered. So many had given their lives already. Even if reinforcements were coming, they could not possibly arrive in time. He ordered all arms and ammunition on Bataan destroyed. Army engineers blew up the ammunition dumps, setting off huge explosions at the southern end of the island.
We got the order, throw your arms, destroy your arms, break your arms, So that's it. It was surrender.
We have to scuttle our weapons piece by piece and throw them all over the place. But some, it's already planned though. Some of the units just hide them up for guerrilla operation.
No American reinforcements ever came to the Philippines. And on April 9, 1942, General King surrendered his Bataan force of almost 80,000 men to General Homa, including troops from the Philippine Army, the U.S. Army and its Philippine Scouts, and U.S. National Guard units that had been brought to the Philippines before the Japanese attack. It was the largest surrender of U.S. troops ever. Coincidentally, April 9 was the anniversary of General Robert E. Lee's surrender to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox, 77 years before. And General King surrendered for the same reason, to spare the lives of his trapped, exhausted soldiers. If General King had known what was going to happen next, he might have reconsidered. He had trucks set aside to carry his men to the Japanese prison camp, wherever that might be. But the Japanese commandeered the trucks to bring their own troops and artillery into Bataan. As American and Filipino troops came out of the jungle, Japanese soldiers searched them and took everything they had: watches, money, insignia, photographs, West Point rings. Anyone who resisted was beaten.